Hello again. I feel like I've been here before. As Craig's described, Alzheimer's disease has undergone this process of redefinition. And before I kind of go into some of what I'd probably term the ethical and social considerations when communicating about this new definition of Alzheimer's disease, is that this is the latest in a series of redefinitions. And there's a really nice analogy used by a medical sociologist who talks about how every time you redefine, how every disease has undergone this process of redefining diagnoses. And it's like putting new furniture into a room, and you get the nice new shiny furniture that's there, but you've also still got all the other bits of furniture that you fall over as you're kind of going around the room. So by introducing new terminology and new criteria for disease, all the old language is still there as well. And so I want to kind of talk about what it is that we're communicating. And so this is taking an unscientific sample from a range of clinical and research documents that I've come across recently. There we go. So a selection of buckets, to use Craig's terminology, that refer to the state that exists before people get to dementia. And that some of these, and I think that what I've tried to do with the colours is to show that the different ways in which we talk about these stages actually have quite different meanings. So some of the ones in purple, are quite descriptive terms of a biological state that somebody is in now. Others, the red ones, are probabilistic. So they suggest that this biological state may have implications for where this person is heading in the future. So they are asymptomatic at risk, or they have an estimated higher risk. And then finally, there's another group that suggests that this population continuum is actually an individual disease trajectory. So the use of terms like preclinical, prodromal, each of these carries a clear expectation for the future. So the 2 points, there is this variation in language, and that it would be nice if we could move towards a kind of common understanding of pathology and disease progression. And so Bruno Dubois, in a 2010 paper introducing this new lexicon of Alzheimer's disease, said that it's important to keep the research and clinical views of the disease from becoming too widely separated. And I think that what we're highlighting here is that we need to do that beyond research and clinical, but also public as well. And that the terms that we use then have implications for how we think about where the disease is going for individual people. So I want to move on to talk about to whom we're talking about. So the extension of this continuum of Alzheimer's disease earlier in the life course and to earlier stages of pathological change leads to questions about if, when, and to whom information about biomarker-based information about disease progression should be communicated. And these questions have been considered since the identification of the ApoE susceptibility gene in the early 1990s. And in terms of these new categories, sorry, Craig, I'm going to use the preclinical prodromal. Okay, thank you. So there are two contexts, really. The first is in communicating ApoE or biomarker status to people who are in a prodromal stage of disease or have mild cognitive impairment. And here, Corinna Porteri and Giovanni Frazzoni proposed a range of pros and cons related to communicating biomarkers as part of a diagnostic process. So in a review from the American College of Medical Genetics, they said that ApoE status should be used only in the context of counselling. Porteri and Frazzoni point out that biomarkers may have diagnostic value in the context of MCI or prodromal Alzheimer's disease. But as Craig points out, these measures are still experimental and their value is uncertain. Disclosure respects an individual's right to know about their biological state, but it also raises concerns about harm associated with knowledge, the psychological and social impacts, including the potential stigma attached to this information. It provides an ability to plan for the future, but at the same time, there's a lack of effective treatment options. So reflecting this, there's quite a lot of national variation in kind of current clinical practice about how biomarkers are used in the clinic. In terms of the preclinical or the asymptomatic stage, we might say, it's slightly clearer in that the guidelines from around genetic testing and around amyloid suggest that there's limited value, if any, of disclosing this information to asymptomatic people. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So lots of people know their ApoE status through 23andMe. In the case of amyloid imaging, so Johnson and colleagues were commissioned by this working group for the Alzheimer's Association in the US and argued that currently the potential harms of disclosing amyloid information to people, to asymptomatic people, outweigh the minimal benefits. But clinical trials which recruit on the basis of genotypes or biomarkers represent a distinct circumstance. So here people have a right to know why they are being contacted to take part in research in order that they can make an informed decision about participation. So Scott Kim and colleagues consider the arguments against disclosure as part of transparent recruitment and conclude that the existing evidence, particularly from the REVEAL study of ApoE disclosure, suggests that no significant harm is caused by learning risk. Although we might argue that this research has limitations in terms of its scope and the implementation of biomarker-based Alzheimer's medicine, and that we might also need to think more broadly about what actually constitutes harm in terms of the communication of a risk of Alzheimer's dementia. At the moment, we thought very, very narrowly in terms of the impact on individuals, not on partners, on families, and in terms of the longer-term implications in terms of health surveillance and disease stigma as well. Kim and colleagues argue that providing this information isn't coercive, and that particularly in the case of sporadic Alzheimer's disease, it doesn't involve over-targeting specific or potentially vulnerable groups. And so they say the only reason that you wouldn't disclose as part of trial recruitment is if there's a valid reason for expecting it to jeopardize the scientific validity of the study. So that, in that context, then, that creates the question of how you go about communicating this information. And I think there's a fundamental question here, which I hinted at this morning, of what type of information is this? So a lot of the guidance that's been developed draws on genetic testing. Oops. But to what extent were guidelines that were developed in the case of Huntington's disease genes, then translated to the context of ApoE genes, then translatable again into the context of amyloid status? So this kind of question is being asked within secondary prevention studies that are going on. So Harkins and colleagues working with the anti-amyloid in asymptomatic Alzheimer's, or the A4 study, describe an approach based on they conducted a modified Delphi method with experts in Alzheimer's disease research and genetic testing, and produced a set of recommendations around amyloid disclosure. They placed an emphasis on an education process, that people going into trials should be screened for anxiety and depression to determine their suitability to receive this type of information, that the person conducting the sessions should check comprehension and be skilled in communication, that there should be a separation between consent, imaging, and disclosure, and that disclosure should take place in person with time for questions. A written report of results should be provided, and then people should be followed up by telephone. A second piece of work by Lingler and colleagues looks at the disclosure of PET amyloid status to people with mild cognitive impairment. And again, they recommended that pre-test counselling should take place, that the information should be provided using clear graphics, that clinicians should review people's own brain images with them during the disclosure process. They should offer take-home materials. They should then call the participants after disclosure to address emerging questions, and that they should make sure that this information is communicated seamlessly to primary care providers. So already you're creating quite an infrastructure around the disclosure of this information, and I think this is a kind of a question that as we go forward with the development of research in this area, that we need to continue to work on how we should go about communicating things like biomarkers. In the context of EPAD, myself and Anna Diaz from Alzheimer Europe have conducted qualitative work with the European Working Group of People with Dementia and with potential EPAD research participants in the UK and Spain to explore their expectations about the implications of learning risk information and their expectations of what a disclosure process would involve. So to the 8 recommendations developed by Harkins and the 6 developed by Lingler, we've added another 11, which, yeah. So, but there is some overlap between these, but this is the 11, and I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail. But what I do want to do is highlight 5 of them. So this is the risk disclosure process, people are very clear, should make clear that this is a risk status, not a diagnosis. And this is where this distinction between disease and dementia becomes very important in terms of what's a risk, what's a disease, and what's a diagnosis. People wanted clear and consistent information on what risks means, and obviously given the uncertainty that Craig described and the fact that so many of the models are still hypothetical, there are no p-values, it becomes difficult to clarify what clear information is. The information and its interpretation should be consistent, whether communicated by researchers or in medical practice, including GPs. And this came out again and again in the focus groups, that if you're told by somebody that you have an unusual or abnormal amyloid status, and you then take that information to your GP, then to what extent is that information comprehensible? How does that information go outside the research context? People are very keen that communicating risk status should be accompanied with the best available information on how you go about reducing risk. And again, this is areas where the evidence is developing but not concrete. And then finally, this idea that in the future it's important that people have equal access to information about risk. And this is particularly important, I think, at the moment in terms of when we think about the question of justice associated with trials, that the biomarkers that we're able to produce at the moment rely on technologies which are often quite expensive or require expertise and which are not necessarily widely available. And so you're going to end up with a patterning of people who have access to to knowing their risk and people who don't, depending on their geography or their social position. Okay, so to go back to the what, to whom, and how, I'll say that what, we need clarity and continuity between a research, clinical, and public language, and it would be a start in terms of thinking about the ethical considerations in how we go about communicating Alzheimer's disease. In terms of whom, for now, there's variation around the use of biomarkers and genotypes in clinical settings, and we need to better understand how and why this occurs and where. There's still a presumption against communicating biomarkers and ApoE status to asymptomatic individuals, but in clinical trial settings, clinical trials have a duty to be open about their recruitment approach, and this work involves working out how best to go about communicating a risk status. There's some work going on around this question, but we do need more. So we've developed recommendations within EPAD based on input from people with dementia and people without dementia involved in the kind of research that may lead to disclosure. But we need further guidance on this. And then finally, I want to flag up a couple of further areas we need to understand. I started by talking about the need for common language for disease, but perhaps what's more important is the need for common language to talk about the people who are at various stages on this continuum. So there's been a move and a shift, and we've heard it throughout the conference, to talk about people with dementia rather than as sufferers. But how do we talk about people who are in preclinical or prodromal states? In scientific, regulatory, and policy contexts, they're often referred to as patients. We talk about targeting the right patient at the right time, but for at-risk, for people in these early disease stages, they are not yet patients, they're not seeking medical care. And it's more than a semantic point, because by labeling people as patients, we authorize them to do certain things and we authorize society to do certain things to them. It has implications for how these people see themselves and their futures. And so this is where I end up being far more sociological than ethical at the end, because these kind of questions have been classic focuses of medical sociology, and we've which has developed terms like patients in waiting to describe some of these kind of new risk states. Or in the context of genetic risk, people have described people as patient clients, trying to capture the fact that this is an intermediate phase between health and illness. In the context of EPAD, we've been very keen to push the term participants to capture the people who are involved in the research rather than referring to them as patients, which we also intend to reflect the fact that we want people to be actively involved in the governance of the project and in making it better. So, but yeah, as these new disease categories do become more widespread, we do need to think about how we talk about the people who fit into them. So, I'll leave that